I'm Dr. Scott Masson with our episode in Paideia today with my colleague here, Dr. Bill Friesen. And we are looking at the Underworld here in the Odyssey. And I think we wanted to start off, Bill, you wanted to start off by reading us something?
Yeah, this comes out of book 11 here, starts at line 23, where Odysseus is attempting to enact the ritual he has been instructed in order to have access to the dead, the realms of the dead, and the wisdom and the rites of passages that are bound up in that. So I'll just begin reading here at 23. There Prometheus and Eurolocos held the victim fast, and I, drawing from beside my thigh my sharp sword, dug a pit of about a cubit in each direction and poured it full of drink offerings for all the dead. First, honey mixed with milk, and second pouring was a sweet wine, and the third, water, and over it all I sprinkled white barley. I promised many times to the strengthless heads of the perished dead that, returning to Ithaka, I would slaughter a barren cow, my best, in my place, and pile the pyre with treasures, and to Tiresias apart would dedicate an all-black ram, the one conspicuous in all our sheep flocks. Now, when, with sacrifices and prayers, I had so entreated the hordes of the dead, I took the sheep and cut their throats over the pit, and the dark clouding blood ran in, and the souls of the perished dead gathered in that place, up out of Erebus, brides and young unmarried men and long-suffering elders, virgins tender and with the sorrows of young hearts upon them, and many fighting men killed in battle, stabbed with brazen spears, still carrying their bloody armor upon them. These came swarming around my pit from every direction with inhuman clamor, and green fear took hold of me. Then I encouraged my companions and told them, taking the sheep that were lying by, slaughtered with the pitiless bronze, to skin these and burn them, and pray with the divinities to Hades, the powerful, and to revered Persephone, while I myself, drawing from beside my thigh my sharp sword, crouched there, but would not let the strengthless heads of the perished dead draw near to the blood until I had questioned Tiresias.
So this is a really interesting passage, and it's the first encounter, at least in the Greek epic, of the underworld, and this is something we're going to see again and again in our study of the epic. We'll go from here to the Roman epic, and we'll look at how it's presented there, and we'll see it in various renditions through Milton, through Dante, through other figures. But it's important to note that this is at the nadir. It's at the bottom of a series of tests that Odysseus tells us that he had to undergo in order to come to the land of the Phaeacians, to whom he's telling the story. So book 11 falls right in the midst of his stories. He's recounting to the Phaeacians how he came to go from Troy, where he started, to be on their shores. Now remember, the Phaeacians are a sort of semi-divine place. It's a very mysterious realm, and it no longer exists after Odysseus gets out of there. Poseidon is so angry that he got out of there that the gods agree that this will never happen again, and the Phaeacians can never be visited because of what they did and so forth, and thwarting him. But this is the series of episodes in which he has to encounter supernatural danger. So he starts off by when he leaves Troy, he fights against the Cicones. And the Cicones were a group that they're Greeks, but they allied themselves with the Trojans back in the time of the Trojan War. So he has to get past them. Then he comes to the land of the Lotus Eaters. Then he comes to the Cyclops, whom we mentioned last time, Polyphemus. Then he comes to Aeolus, a place of winds. Then he comes to the Lastrygonians, who are cannibals. Then he comes to Circe. And Circe tells him that he has to go down to the underworld in order to find his way back home. Having gone to Circe, he now finds himself in the underworld. And let me just talk about having come down to the underworld, he then comes out of it, but that's not the end of the dangers. He then moves on to encounter the Sirens, the Scylla, the cattle of the sun, and Helios, the sun god, and they're
right.
told not to touch those cows, but then of course they slaughter them all crazily.
You know, as soon as they're
And then
told that they're not to touch the cattle, they're going to touch the cattle.
yeah, of course, like a small child, don't touch that, and there you go. Then they encounter Charybdis, and then finally they encounter Calypso. Now, at that point, when I say they, there's no one left but Odysseus. Now, he is on the island of Calypso, and that's the last place he is before, and we meet him first in book 5, but this is the last threat that he faces before he finds himself in front of the Phaeacians. And then you might ask what the threat is. There is no physical threat, unlike the other ones, and there's no real danger to him. The threat is that he will be forever hidden from the world, that he will gain immortality, yet without glory.
That's right. What is being threatened here is his status as hero.
Yes.
Because this is the case which is under question throughout the entire length of the Odyssey. Is he a hero? And if he is a hero, of what nature is that hero? And how does he differ from other heroes in the Greek imagination?
And when I say he doesn't have fame, it's not quite accurate. He is already famous, because we even saw that back in the Telemachy. They're already talking about the famous Odysseus. He's well known everywhere. Even in the underworld, they know of Odysseus's fame. But what has not yet happened is the man and the fame have not yet united. So until he returns home, he doesn't really receive the benefits of his fame. And that's interesting, because when we compare and contrast him with Achilles, who's going to meet in the underworld, who has fame and yet does not return home. And so that those two are juxtaposed there, and that's an interesting comparison there.
This ties in also to a couple of other things we've been previously discussing, because until Odysseus returns to Ithaca, he cannot receive the benefits of the glory he has won at such great cost here. And remember, in the realm of the dead, you're not in a position usually to enjoy the glory, the kleos that you have acquired over your life. So if you don't enjoy it during your lifetime while living, then you've missed out. So here it is absolutely imperative that he reap the benefits of his heroism by living to make it back to Ithaca, where he can sort of draw his great heroic saga to a close and enjoy the fruits thereof. Yeah. And that's what we see him doing at the end to some extent, albeit mixed with great sorrow of a very complex nature.
So he goes down, and as you say, he meets this figure Tiresias, to whom he offers this blood sacrifice. Mm-hmm. Very specific. It's a black ram, and its blood is mixed with various things. I want to talk about this weird figure of Tiresias, because this is a figure we're going to meet in the tragedy as well. Yeah. Tiresias is the central figure, a prophet we meet in Thebes. You know, he will be the essential figure for Oedipus to meet in order to solve the mystery of the Sphinx and so forth, and the mystery of his own being. But here we meet him in the underworld, and I want to say something about this figure, because he is a really thoroughly strange figure. And why is he there, and who is he? So Tiresias is, it's almost difficult to say, because there are so many myths related to him. I think there are something like 18 different myths, and different attributes are connected to different myths.
And we only have fragments and bits of most of those myths as well. So it's as it were through a glass darkly that we're seeing these 18 different strands and how they tie together, if they tie together, and what their sources were. Oftentimes we simply don't know.
But in all of them, he's blind. He's also gifted with prophecy, and he's also gifted with an extraordinarily long life. And there are various explanations for why these things are. And almost the source of his wisdom is the fact that he's an androgynous figure. He has experienced both male and female identity. One of the accounts says that he was transformed into a woman by Hera when he struck 2 snakes with a stick. And he thereby became a priestess of Hera and served him as a woman, and not only served him as a woman, but had children from that marriage. And then he encountered another series of copulating snakes, and he didn't strike them, and then he was turned back into a man. So that's one of the accounts of his androgyny. And by the way, the turning him into a female was a punishment in Hera's understanding. Now, I have no idea why Hera would be angry about him striking copulating snakes, or why he'd be punished for it. All these things are told, and they're not explained. So that's recorded in lost lines of Hesiod. They're not in Hesiod. They're mentioned by other writers that they were in Hesiod. We don't have those lines. In other accounts, there's a dispute between Hera and Zeus over which one of the two, the male or the female, enjoys the act of sex more. Zeus maintains that it's the female. Hera maintains that it's the male. The verdict of Tiresias is that the female enjoys it 10 times more, for which he is punished by Hera, who's angry with that outcome and struck with blindness. And he's rewarded, however, with a very happy Zeus, with the gift of prophecy and the gift of long life 7 times. So those things are lying in the background. But what is of interest to me, and that we don't need to get caught up into that, is that he is blind, prophetic, and androgynous. And the androgyny of this strange figure, this interstitial figure, this sort of where does he belong in the great scheme of things, is common in many ancient religions.
And even modern religions, as an anthropological point, the shaman figure, as you pointed out earlier, is somebody who is oftentimes an extremely androgynous individual. They're not strongly gendered. And they oftentimes occupy a strange space, like outside of the community, outside of what we would call the polis in this case here. And people would come to them at a certain point in their life for matters of transition. So it's this sense of transition, this sort of interstitial movement between two clearly defined places, states, things, which I think is informing a lot of stuff that's happening here. We also see a lot of conflation of roles when it comes to this. A lot of people will recognize the intertwining snakes as an aspect of Zeus's iconography. Not Zeus, sorry, Apollo's iconography.
Apollo, yeah.
Yes, and Apollo, of course, is also the god of prophecy later on, and he's also the god of poetry. This intertwining of poetry and prophecy we'll see as a strand, a notion which travels down the ages throughout the Greek period and then into the Roman period as well. A lot of the words for poet conflate with prophet, and there's a strong sense that what they're doing is in many ways similar, and the sources from which they're doing it are similar. The rituals around it are similar. It's not clear where the prophet ends and the poet begins in ancient literature. Tiresias is this powerful prophet figure, and why Zeus should be giving him prophecy rather than Apollo is, it's a bit curious, if I'm honest.
It is curious. The other thing that's all of that, what we just said about Tiresias and his androgyny and all those backstories, they are not in Homer. That is background information. I don't know if it's helpful or not. It's interesting.
It's very likely, though, the original audience would have been well aware of many, if not all. That's
my point.
Yes.
Yeah, and so it's helpful when you're reading these things to have a sense of what you're encountering and why this is important. So as you say, it's this figure that lives in the upper world, but also in the underworld. He seems to be between the gods and men. He's a figure of wisdom. He's a figure of prophecy. He's a figure of androgyny. We're not exactly sure all of the things that he represents in some ways, but he does seem to usher. He's the place that the witch Circe sends him to, precisely to this figure, in order to encounter to receive the wisdom that he needs to get back home. But having received the wisdom, he goes back to Circe, and Circe tells him everything that he just learned from Tiresias. So it doesn't sound like he even needed to do this. It's almost like a rite of passage that he should go down to the underworld.
And this, I think, is why that shaman analogy is particularly helpful. There's something the hero Odysseus is undergoing when he goes into the underworld, which is not merely the practical acquisition of knowledge or wisdom or anything like that. There's something else that is happening here that transforms him in a fundamental sense as a man, as a hero, as all these things.
And that is that he goes down to the realm of the dead and comes up from them. And there's only one other figure in the Greek world that does this, and that is Heracles, whom he meets in the underworld here and speaks to. And so that's interesting as well. And that's part of his particular mark of epic heroism, is that he not only goes down to the realm of the dead, but he rises from it, which is not something that Achilles does.
And interestingly, at least in later iterations, we know that Heracles undergoes an apotheosis whereby he is included amongst the gods high up in Olympus, Whereas we know at the end of the day, Odysseus will die and go down to this realm of Hades here, which he is just visiting at this point. So there's an interesting juxtaposition there, though I'm not sure the original audience would have been aware of that.
But that's all of those things are interesting, and then this becomes a feature of epic, the epic thereafter, that a hero in an epic narrative will go down to the realm of the dead and will rise from it, and that's significant. So we don't find that in the Iliad, but we do find it in the Odyssey, and thereafter it becomes a mark of every epic.
Yes, this is the foundational journey to the dead narrative in the West. So many things that are happening here become the catalyst for large, eloquent develops in that style or genre of narrative in the upcoming 2,800 years. Another thing we should perhaps mention here, like I said, there's a lot of features that occur here. We have a very elaborate ritual by which one enters the realm of the dead. Virgil will play off of this with the golden bow and all that stuff. Later on, we're going to see Dante do something really quite brilliant with it. He takes that situation, and it turns out that he needs to encounter people and go particular places and get particular wisdom, even start the journey through the realm of the supernatural, for lack of a better word. So we've got that. We've got the dead, of course, and we have a bit of a pageant play as one famous figure after another goes past from the realm of the dead. In more modern times, we find, sadly, such ignorance about this tradition of journeys to the dead, the literary treatment of the journey to the realm of the dead, that we have science fiction genres which style themselves as being able to do this, and they have no idea that there are many famous writers who have gone before and done this kind of thing already. The most prominent of these genres is called Bangsian science fiction. It's about somebody who has a houseboat on the Styx, which is a novel notion, I'll grant you, but still.
Good place to go on holiday.
That's right. Go for a cruise. The last thing I'll mention on this front as kind of a foundational element is it was a King Minos, I believe, is down in the realm of the dead as well, and he's being asked. This is very ambiguous, and it's to me a very interesting passage. He's being asked by the dead, who within a few lines of here are said to be voiceless, but nevertheless he is being asked by the dead to pass judgment.
Yes, he is called the judge of the dead, but he's also being asked to pass judgment.
Yes. So what is he judging? Are they virtues? Are they deeds? Are they bloodlines and nobility? What exactly is being judged? What are the ramifications of him judging? Are there punishments? Are there places? We know none of this.
I mean, I'm just speculating here. In Homer's day, the judge is also the king. The king is the judge. One of Odysseus's problems is that in his absence, his land has become lawless. It has no one to judge and punish malefactors.
That's
and
right.
So it's almost like the realm of the dead is like life above the ground. So they're still carrying on. It's just a bloodless and a lifeless and a unsatisfactory form of life.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like they still require a king. And so Minos, who's the judge, is a sort of a king of the underworld, even though he's not the god of the underworld, but he does seem to be like a king.
Which is curious, because the god should be in some senses the king of the underworld. So why is that not happening? Later on, when we come to the Aeneid, we're going to encounter the figure of Rhadamanthus, who very explicitly is judging the virtues and the evils of those who come before him and punishing them accordingly in very clear, categorical, and articulated terms.
Yeah, and I think when we come to the Aeneid, that will give us a great deal of, that's a good discussion point, because here in the Odyssey, we don't see bad guys. There aren't bad men there. They're not being punished. There isn't. This is the realm of the dead. Everyone goes there, whether they're a hero or anyone else. Now, we're only told about the heroes. So when Odysseus goes down there, we're not told about any other figures, but we do meet various famous figures. So we meet Alcinous there, we meet Agamemnon, we meet Achilles, we meet Ajax. So his compatriots, the most famous of them, he speaks to them and sees them. He also sees his mother. He also sees Elpenor, who fell off the roof of, is it Circe, I think, and broke his neck and lay unburied. So and begs Odysseus to go back and bury him so that he can get where he needs to go, which is the other side of where the dead belong.
Yeah, I mean, curiously, his purpose in begging to be buried is so that he can cease his shade can cease its wandering ways, and end up in the realm of the dead. But of course, Achilles makes it perfectly clear in the same book of the Odyssey that the realm of the dead is profoundly unsatisfying. This is a terrible place to be and in which to find oneself. So exactly why Elpenor wants to quit his wanderings and get to the place which won't satisfy is hard to say. There are a lot of inconsistencies here.
No, it's almost like an instinct, right? He has to go there, but he doesn't know why.
Yeah. And this is another thing about, I mean, the amorality of the Greek afterlife is one of his key features, and it ties into what you just said, which is that whether you were a great man or you were the lowest person on the social totem pole, it doesn't matter. Your reward is always the same. You end up in the realm of the dead. And I think that does speak very much to the crisis, the moral crisis, the spiritual crisis, the artistic crisis of the Greek mind. And it will haunt Greek literature throughout. And we're going to come back and talk maybe a little bit more about that when we talk about Greek drama. But just to signal it for now here in this text.
So he also encounters Agamemnon, and Agamemnon was, of course, the leader of the Achaeans, and Agamemnon recounts the same story that we had heard Zeus and the Olympian gods recounting, which is the story of his return and his betrayal by his wife Clytemnestra and Aegisthus and so forth. And he tells Odysseus this in order to warn him that when he goes home, he'd better watch out. Now, he says that his wife is different than Clytemnestra, but all the same, don't trust women, basically. But that's part of his advice there, and he keeps on hearing the same advice, that he needs to be careful when he goes home. And Athena will give him the same advice. You can't go home as if you were, I mean, you have to go in incognito, basically. And then he comes across Achilles, and Achilles, he tries to praise Achilles and says, wow, while you were alive, the army honored you like a god, and now you're here and you rule the dead with might. Isn't this great? And Achilles just
shuts him down.
Let me, like for the second time, let me stop you right there. Odysseus, you know, I know you always are full of blandishments. You talk, you say one thing in your mouth and you hide another behind in your heart. I'd rather be a hired hand back on earth or a slave behind a farmer slaving away for some poor dirt farmer than be the lord of all the withered dead. This is a terrible place to be. Stop talking nonsense.
So it's a ringing indictment of the heroism dynamic. This is the thing that drives Odysseus out from, his time, as you mentioned, with Calypso. He wants to actually realize the fruits of his heroism on the other hand. So it seems that on the key issues, especially around issues around heroism, Achilles and Odysseus will never agree. And so you have here again that Greek love for debate. Achilles holds one view on heroism. Odysseus clearly holds another. They've both got talking points, and the talking points weave together and counter each other or fortify each other. But the bottom line is this is a debate waiting to happen amongst the audience after they listen to this exchange between these two men yet again. So
yet again.
And Odysseus, Achilles and Odysseus, Achilles and Odysseus, and there you are.
But there are no villains. We're not told of any villains. There's no bad guys being punished there. In fact, there is no punishment for the dead, it seems, other than the dead who are not men, but rather Titans. Mm-hmm. And they come right towards the conclusion of Book 11. We're told about 3 Titans. We're told about Tityos, we're told about Tantalus, and we're told about Sisyphus. And all of them are figures that are mentioned in later epics as figures of the underworld. But so these were the earth gods who rebelled against the Olympian, the sky gods. Mm-hmm. And their punishment is to be thrown down in the realm of men. So to be treated beneath their dignity as gods.
That's right. And this comes out of a wider mythological tradition amongst the Greeks, where, of course, you have one of the great battles at the beginning where Python, the great monster, is thrown down, and he's thrown down into the realm of the dead. And now we find these people here thrown down into the realm of the dead, being punished in the realm of the dead. But punished is, it's a word that can be misleading, I think, because this is not an act, however misguided, of justice. One gets a very clear sense that this is an act of vengeance.
Yes.
Justice. The Romans, of course, are going to make a very keen distinction between those two things, though they're also very big in their own way on vengeance, but they're also obsessed with justice, whereas you do not encounter that here. There's a Greek ambivalence towards why these people are suffering as they do, and the important thing is that they have dared to confront the gods, and they've ended up here in great agony for the rest of eternity, one presumes.
Yeah, and so I mean the recounting of these punishments is quite lurid actually. So Tydeus, yeah, he's lying on the earth, stretched like Prometheus will be in the Roman
Exactly.
rendition,
Yes.
and his liver is being eaten by two vultures, and then it regrows, and then he suffers the same fate eternally. And Tantalus is in agony. He's standing in a pool of water up to his chin, but he can't take a drink. It's
And also,
tantalizing.
there's the grapes above him, which always rise out of reach as soon as he reaches for them. So thirst and hunger forever, for all eternity, tantalize him, if you will.
Tantalizing, and then Sisyphus rolling the stone up, and then it rolls back down. So eternal laboring without any satisfaction from his labor. So these are forms of simply punishment, and there's no justice in it. It is, as you say, simply punishment. So those are interesting things about the Greek underworld.
And these three figures and their punishment have become watchwords in Western mythology.
Yeah.
Everybody knows the story of these individuals. Of course, the Greeks were keenly aware that, on just sort of a side note here, that the liver was a particularly painful organ to have injured. In fact, at one point, the Greeks in Athens made it a form of execution for the most loathed of criminals or offenders, where they would stab you in the liver with an iron spike and you would slowly die an agonizing death. So this was something that was quick to the Greek imagination.
How do you always know details like that, Bill?
Oh, I've got a lot of these. I have got a lot of these. We'll get into those presently. Just wait for them.
Right. Stay on your good side. And then finally encounters Heracles, and this is, or rather, the Phantom of Heracles. So this is what is different. Heracles is a phantom,
Yes,
because he himself is with the gods, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
But the Phantom of Heracles is down there, and as he moves, there's a clamor of the dead behind him, as if birds are flying off in terror, and he looks like midnight himself. This is a really strange discussion of Heracles, and Heracles then addresses him and speaks to him and tells him that how poor he is, and mentions the similarity in their two fates, and then directs him back up above the realm of the dead.
Yeah,
So,
we won't discuss it here, but of course there comes out clearly a Greek tradition, largely lost, of Heracles in the underworld. One has to remember here that this fits into a family of tales on this sort of leitmotif, which have now largely been lost.
yeah.
Oftentimes later writers and later dramatists are, to use modern language, riffing off of this leitmotif, and we're not seeing the connections. But we know that there were connections to be made that very likely the original audiences would have found quite interesting.
So having addressed him, Heracles then tells him, he goes back to the house of Hades where he lives, or at least the Phantom of Heracles, and then Odysseus is left on his own, and he longs to meet Theseus, for instance, another great hero who went down to the underworld, but he's afraid that Persephone will arise from Hades' depths and send the pale head of the monster Gorgon. And so he then scoots out and gets out of the underworld. Now that, again, the Gorgon is a figure that's mentioned in later epics as this hideous figure. Here it's the only figure that is monstrous in the whole underworld of Homer. Whereas when we come to the Aeneid, we'll find all sorts of monsters.
Yes, absolutely. So in that sense, the Romans again had made a serious advance on the Greeks in notions of monstrousness and how this connects with notions of evil and things like that, which you don't encounter, quite interestingly, in the Odyssey. These things are all absent. And of course, one of the big dangers as a modern reader is to exert the discipline and the faithfulness as a reader not to impose either explicitly or subconsciously these notions on a text which doesn't support or which can't support them. So is the Gorgon even a monster, properly speaking? We might say so. Would they? They might come up with a different.
Not quite sure. And again, the monsters Odysseus has encountered were above the world, in the world above.
Exactly. These are things in the realm of the living, which could send you to Hades, quite certainly, and indeed do. They end up wiping out his entire crew in spite of his desperate attempts to save them.
Yeah.
But they themselves are not from the realm of the dead itself, whereas later on that changes. Do we want to talk about Elpenor?
What about Elpenor? Go ahead.
Yeah, Elpenor he becomes this figure again just to make a quick connection between this and the Aeneid, he's somebody who sets up a discussion that Virgil has later on, and Virgil makes some of the same arguments, that are made in the Odyssey. But we have to remember that the Odyssey is potentially also playing off of a similar sort of discussion around the desecration of the dead and the desecration of Hector that we encountered in the Iliad. So the point here to me is that, again, on this level, all these texts are speaking back to one another. And if you miss that point, you're going to miss a large part of the enjoyment that's to be derived from coming at these classical texts.
I guess there's something being said about, even though they go down to the underworld and they are shades, there isn't a full-blooded anthropology there as we would understand it. So, but
No.
there is a sense of the sanctity of the body. The body seems to matter, while at the same time, and it's not fully developed here, we'll see it more when we come to Virgil's Aeneid, there's a sense that the soul is the true self, and that is a disembodied self.
I mean, we have fundamental differences that have been discussed elsewhere by very knowledgeable writers between, later notions of the soul, the anima, as the Romans would call it. Yeah, and the psyche here that we encounter amongst the Greeks. These are not the same thing. The Romans also much more categorically define the nature and the scope of the self and its worth. Whereas for the Greeks, we have to remember that, yeah, it's right. They don't have a developed sort of anthropology of what's going on here. They don't have a clear cosmological view. Their sense of these things is, in one sense, more vigorous in that it's very organic. It is experienced, just like Tiresias and his knowledge about relations between men and women and stuff like this. Tiresias is not abstract knowledge; he's lived it. They're not developing something fundamentally new, radically new.
Good.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.